Very good morning from India to all the participants from across the globe. Welcome to Ask the Expert People's Podium, powered by LBN Tech Solutions and All Ladies League. I am Megalai Senthilkumar and I am the host for this session. Today is our 24th edition of Ask the Expert, and the topic for today is parenting in the pandemic times and beyond. The whole world, and especially India, is going through a deep crisis, while we adults grapple with issues related to vaccines, beds, oxygen, remdesivir. Our children are also going through the worst phase of their childhood. What is childhood without going to school? Meeting their friends, playing in parks, and going on picnics. Parents across nations are facing with several issues related to online classes and coping with school, and no physical activity and junk food and too much of screen time and all its allied problems. So to talk about these issues and also to provide solutions to these issues as well as many more, we have our expert speaker amidst us, Dr. Priya Kandhadai. Welcome to the session, Priya. I'm so happy to have you here. A little bit about our esteemed speaker. Dr. Padma Priya Kandhadai received her MSc in Computer Science and PhD in Cognitive Psychology. Priya's research focuses on language, learning, and memory. At the University of British Columbia, she has taught courses in childhood development and in cognitive science. In her current position as a faculty member at the Business School in Douglas College, Canada, she teaches mobile and web programming and UX design, allowing her to bring together her interest of knowledge in computer science and psychology. With her research and learning teaching experience and the training on scientific knowledge translation, she hopes to be able to help parents and educators build research-informed knowledge on child development. Priya has completed advanced studies in psychology and computer science, published several research papers on language and learning, has undergone knowledge translation training from Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research. She has served on the advisory board of Kid Care Canada, a non-profit organization that spreads awareness on influences of early childhood development and later life outcomes, has taught courses at the university that focus on interdisciplinary learning from diverse fields such as computer science, psychology, and philosophy. She's the mother of two lovely kids, 10 and a 6-year-old, and she's a wonderful singer too. And she lives in Vancouver, Canada, which is pretty late out there. Thanks so much for coming in to this session, although it is late into the night, almost past 9:30, I think. Welcome, Priya, once again. And moderating this session is another esteemed speaker, and a little bit about her. Dr. Sujatha Muthanna, a member of All Ladies League. She's also a member of WICI, Women's Indian Chamber of Commerce. And she is a talent strategist trained in design thinking of the D School of Stanford University. Dr. Sujatha Muthanna has played an integral role in coaching 70+ marquee clients of Infosys across the globe in the transformational journey pivoted on business impact. She has got 18+ years of diverse experience in academic and corporate area. She's an executive coach, PPC from the International Coach Federation, who has coached C-suite clients. She has coached entrepreneurs from across geographies on business and leadership crucibles. While at the heart of all she does, she is intrigued by the curiosity children and adolescents have about life and their dreams, and is looking at ways to learn from these pristine mindsets. She hails from the hills of Coorg, and takes pride in the culture of a tribe, the Kodavas. An environmentalist working towards protection of biodiversity in the Western Ghats, she enjoys an occasional swing of golf, while poetry, music, and exploring places, spending time with her son, husband, family, and friends sum up her weekend. She is now focusing on the launch of her agro product line, Rustic Earth to Soul from the Hills. So before I hand over the floor to you, the moderated session will be followed by the Q&A session. The questions which you have can be typed in the chat box, and the speaker will answer after the end of the moderated session. And over to you, Sujatha. The floor is all yours, and we're all waiting to listen from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here. It's a pleasure having you, Priya, Dr. Priya Kandhadai. We've had some conversations in the last couple of months, and which have unraveled a whole lot of interesting facets. And I'm connecting with a couple of them. Going back to the introduction that Megalai had just shared, we're looking at the trajectory of how you moved from computer science to artificial intelligence, and then you're looking at human cognition. I think that's a very, very interesting journey. And given the current situation, the scenario, and I wouldn't only talk about the here and now and the pandemic. In the last couple of years, there have been a lot of mental shifts in the way in which people look at parenting, right? The expectations from children have changed. The expectations from parents have changed. So much of exposure to the World Wide Web and the digital exposure as well. So there are a whole lot of things that children and parents are grappling with or navigating through. So I'm interested to hear from you what your journey has been and what is this piece around digital living that all of us are going through. And as part of this in the past decade and during the pandemic also, how can we view this digital living from the different lenses of parents as well as children? Right? It's an interesting journey, something that we're speaking about. Like, this has become a casual conversation instead of the weather, right? So it's very nice to, see how people are viewing it. And it would be wonderful to hear from you based on the research that you've done in this area.
All right. You can hear me, right, Sujatha? I guess I'm assuming everybody can, if you can hear me. So again, when I get animated or excited, I do tend to speak fast. I will try to slow down and speak clearly into the microphone. Sometimes, I used to accuse my mom of this. She's a teacher herself, where I'd go out of the microphone and then start speaking almost to myself. So if I'm not clear at any point or something that you can't hear, certainly, just stop me right there and ask me to just sort of fix that. Okay. So really, thank you so much for that, introduction, Megu and Sujatha, for that lovely sort of segue into sharing my thoughts. I guess the first thing I want to say is, often with doing knowledge translation, where you're taking research findings and you're translating it into for our own thinking, but also then for sharing it with those around us, there's always this little voice in your head that says, the work that I'm going to be talking or basing off is not just my work. It is done by a huge array of researchers. So what I've tried to do is sort of take those findings and then see how it is applicable, how it's accessible, how it's relevant for the current context.
Yeah, Priya, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
I think one participant says volume a little low. So can you just speak a little louder?
Yes, yeah. I can. And maybe, if you don't mind, maybe I'm just going to, I just want to check to make sure that the settings are okay. So let me just give me 1 second here. Audio. Okay, so maybe, okay, so now is that clearer?
I think it's better. Yeah, it's better. It's better.
Okay, if not, I can change it to my, one of my classroom headphones, which I generally didn't want to intimidate people with my huge headphone. But
no, I think it's fine, Priya. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, super. But if I'm not clear, do ask me to switch. It's worth it. So it's the first thing that I want to just talk a little bit about is first share my ideas of what I see as some broad-ranging, accessible set of findings that might be relevant for us. But I do want to caveat this. I do want to say, many of the things that I probably give, I would think they are more food for thought rather than being sort of transformationally new knowledge. Sometimes it isn't necessarily new knowledge, but it's a different perspective. It's a different sort of collection of thoughts put together. And so what I do want to sort of say is some of these things are either things that some of us might be deeply aware of, but it's harder to practice, and just takes a moment for us to sort of think about how this might apply to our own scenario, to our own situation. So I just want to preface that I've tried to keep it as generic and as applicable and relatable as possible. But at the end of the day, some of these are, what my grandma might have actually told me, but we now have research to sort of support some aspects of those. So I do want to recognize that there is rich parenting history and philosophies that we have, especially in India, just because of the transfer of knowledge and insights that happen over generations. So I do want to take a moment and recognize a lot of validity in that, and then say, can we turn the lens over in this new digital age and see where we get there? So, of course, I feel like deeply affected and influenced by the times we live in, just like every one of us. It's almost like the elephant in the room. So yes, we want to think about how we are going to bring up the best children that we possibly can, the happiest children that we possibly can, 10 years down the road, or maybe even 6 months down the road. But today, the elephant in the room is the pandemic, is COVID-19. And almost everybody feels that stress. But I think as a parent, as a parent, there are some specific challenges or specific things that we grapple with that goes, in a different tangent to what somebody might just experience due to the pandemic itself, which is pretty enormous in itself. Add to that the layer of the parent, and then I will add the layer of the child's perspective. And suddenly now you have a different sort of view to it. First, we worry about our children. Well, there is statistics that shows that, okay, children are generally, they're able to be safe, but it's the vulnerable, the older population. But that doesn't stop us from worrying less about our kids. As parents, there is always that sort of element of thinking about, is my child going to be affected? Am I going to be affected? Not so much from a selfish perspective, but not being able to care for your loved ones or care for your children and those around us. So there is an element of COVID worry there. We live at a very uncertain time. Eventually, there is resilience. There is human spirit of resilience that's going to bounce back. But right now, it's very hard to hold that perspective, at least at all times. So we do live in a really uncertain time. Not to mention the new digital age that we live in, we have an overload of information, right? Just each one of us takes the number of forwards that we get from any one group, all well-meaning, right? It's not somebody that sits there and thinks, okay, I'm going to forward this so that it increases somebody's anxiety. That's not the intention at all. And yet you open your groups, that's the first thing that goes. You see the number of deaths, you see the oxygen tanks. Some of it is very useful information, so I don't want to undermine the utility of that. But the reality is there's an overload of information that then might lead to a different dimension of stress that we bring in as a parent. Online school and social isolation, right? Sometimes we undermine the amount of social connectedness we require, even with a busy schedule, even with managing kids. And so we are having an element of social isolation. But kids are feeling that effect of isolation in very indirect and direct ways. And add to that the challenges of online school. As a parent, it's hard to ignore the elephant in the room. How do they navigate online school? How do we help them navigate online school? What is it that we should be doing? What we could be doing? Are we doing enough? And the guilt kind of takes over in autopilot some days. Not all days, but some days stronger and some days less strong. How do we balance working from home or even it doesn't matter, stay-at-home moms, again, their dynamics changes. They don't get that 2 hours to actually run the errands that they need to run in order to sort of get their ducks lined up. And so this whole idea of balancing home and children and possibly work from home really causes a lot of stress. And one thing what you do see is, of course, online school. There is a lockdown, or there are at least statewide lockdowns and countrywide lockdowns at various phases. So studies show that gaming hours have increased by 75%. And this is just in terms of raw numbers based on children, adolescents and teenagers. And if you look at device use in kids, 66% there is increase of 66% of time spent online on weekdays. Now, part of it is work from home, online school, they're all contributing factors here. where 82% of children report greater device use for connecting with others. Of course, this connecting includes all kinds of connections, but that's what they are reporting. 92% of adults report having an increase in device use. So all of this sort of, now one element is the need, one element is the lockdown. So there's a lot of social isolation time. Lockdown needs require us to be online. But the other major factor, contributing factor, is combating stress and anxiety. So part of some aspect of it is, yes, there are needs that need to be met when you have to be online, but there is a huge sort of coping mechanism that all of us, not just adults, not just children, all of us collectively are engaging in a lot more online behavior specific to this pandemic. And one of the things that is really interesting is the most dominant factor for increased device use, controlling for a whole bunch of different factors, was parents' report of anxiety. That is, the more anxious that they reported that they were anxious, the more they were online, they were increased social media use as well. And what is interesting is kids are in some ways mirroring very similar patterns. When we say kids, this is teenagers, preteens and teenagers. That report greater anxiety are also more on devices, more connected, more on devices and more connected online in social media. And so really what this, and of course I do have to caveat it, younger ages, they're more sort of watching YouTube videos, online shows, not so much social media, but the preteens, teens and teenagers and up. When I say up, it includes the adults, it includes the parents, it includes all of us. We're a lot more on social media, and that seems to, at least one part of being anxious or having anxiety seems to contribute in a sort of a cause effect. I want to be careful and not say that this is causing online device use. You just don't know which is the chicken and which is the egg. Well, I'll come back to that notion later when we get into more depth. Now, one of the sort of, I don't want to put a lot of graphs, I just wanted to put sort of really graphs that sort of hit you home. Mostly it can empower kids when we talk about these patterns to them, rather than saying, because I feel this way. When we have data to support it, it makes a more compelling case for them to think about what we are saying. So what you see is, if we take a step back from the pandemic, this sort of increase in trend of digital use, device use, being on social media, has been on the rise rapidly. It is a linear, it's a rapidly increasing sort of proportion that you see here in the last 10 years. Now, you see it's plotted till 2016, so you may not be able to see it, but what you see is plotted till 2016. So after 2019, it's going to be a huge skyrocket. But even aside from that, the patterns that there is a lot more internet use, lot more gaming, lot more social media use by children, by teens and preteens. Now, what you also see overarchingly, the only thing I want you to note in this graph is, reports of sleep.
Yeah, Priya, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. Are you sharing something? Because we're not able to see anything.
See, thank you. It's clearly been a few days since. I'm so glad. Okay, now you can see it.
Yeah, yes.
Okay,
now we can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, that makes sense. And it was like, okay, wow, how come? Okay, thank you so much. All right, so what I do want to point out here is there's been a steady increase in sort of internet use, gaming use, and social media use. Now, again, as I said, this is something that parents' intuitions lined up with. But sometimes it makes it useful to look at these graphs, just broad patterns, to at least make a compelling case for our children. This is what we see. This is not so much of because I said so, but this is studies that have been done, and that sometimes makes a compelling case, especially with teenagers, but even preteens. The one thing that I want you to just see in this particular graph, you may not be able to see the sort of legend here, but the main takeaway here is internet hours have increased in the last 10 years dramatically, similar to what's plotted here. But the sleep hours, sleep quality, in-person social interaction, and children's report of happiness, whatever that has a lot of dimensionality to it, all of that, there is a downward trend. Now again, I don't want to sort of suggest that, okay, internet use causes these things, but it's useful to keep in mind that somewhere the things that we aspire for ourselves and our children in terms of well-being seems to be on the downslide and there is an increase in that internet use. So it's worth exploring what the relation might be, even if not a cause effect. And so that sort of, things, then that brings us to the issue of, okay, what are the risks and harms? And often, we think of, at least as a parent, my first sort of fight or flight response tends to be, don't do it. It's better to avoid rather than do something and then having to deal with the consequence. It seems much easier to do an avoid strategy, and I'll come back to sort of the children's perspective on that. But the reality is you do sort of see both harms and risks. What are harms? Really broadly, very broad overarching patterns that you might see. It's addictive, it's impulsive, there's a lot of unreliable information, it affects well-being, there is stress, and there's cyberbullying, and privacy and security and confidentiality. Your information is not safe online, and often what we do sort of comes back and haunts us, or haunts our children, in terms of the digital footprint. The permanence of the digital footprint in what we do matters not now, may not matter now, but matters 10 years down the road, 5 years down the road. Now, again, from a children's perspective, it's not that they don't see the harms and the benefits. They see the harms and the benefits, but there is a shift in balance depending on your perspective, whether you think of yourself as a teenager that's an active tech user, or even an adult that's an active tech user that embraces technology. Any new app, let's put it on my phone and see what it does. Or you could be somebody that's really cautious and wary of any of these things. The balance of what is harmful and what are benefits sort of seem to tilt. And when you think of benefits, you can learn a lot online. It's probably the huge vastness of free entertainment out there today is just absolutely mind-boggling. And at the heart of it, we all want to connect, and that's at the heart of what has really exploded social media use, what's exploded internet, the idea of the social connectedness and the broadening of that circle. And it also works as sort of outlets of creativity where we are creating content. It may not be us, but our kids definitely want to create content. They think of themselves as content creators, not just consumers. As parents or adults, there's a divide there, and us thinking ourselves as more content consumers, they think of themselves as content generators. So there is an outlet of creativity there. And it allows them to have a broader, diverse perspective, which they're able to get from the comfort of home. Luckily for some of us, we didn't have to have an opinion about anything, any political party, any social issue. We didn't have to have any opinion until we actually brought the bread home, or until we were old enough to care for our children. But our children don't have that luxury. They are almost expected to be activists from the get-go, and they've sort of risen to that challenge, to looking up what's out there and seeing what their role is in the bigger sort of a community. And so there is some diversity in perspective activism that they're able to sort of tap into when they're working online. So there are sort of both of these aspects, and so really we can't, and some studies have looked at what is really at the heart of that tension. Why is it that it's so hard to, why is there a digital tension? Why can't I monitor? Why can't I impose rules? Why can't I expect them to do the exact same things that we engage with in real world physical rules? One of the primary sort of source of tension is children see diverse utility for online or digital or device use. Whereas, again, not all parents, not all children, there's a huge variety here, but an overarching umbrella, parents see it as one, electronics. Being on device is harmful. At least, again, I wish I could say I'm not that parent. The reality is it's so much easier to clump them together and say, well, you're already 2 hours reading online, so don't spend another hour watching a show. But for them, these are but reading and watching a show, there is no connection. And so they really see diverse utility, whereas I think parents tend to sort of see it as one. And the reality is parents underestimate their own technology use and children's technology use. That is, parents underreport how much time kids spend online. Not intentionally, it's just being unaware. But the reality is, the clincher for me is, as parents or as adults, we don't have a clue how long we've spent. And again, I'll come back to my own anecdote later when we have a moderated discussion about it, if we have time. And children perceive, parents only tell them what behaviors to avoid. Avoidance works at one level, does not work at another level. It's very hard to monitor compliance. It's very hard to make sure they can sustain that. If we just say no, these apps are not allowed, these things are not allowed, and that's end of discussion. So they see it as an avoidance strategy, doesn't necessarily work for them. And the reality is both parents and children do not stick to the household tech rules. I mean, that's the hardest part. Again, this is not about blame assignment, and we're already in a challenging time. So I really don't want a parent to go feel like more guilty. That's not the point. But it's really challenging to be able to stick to the rules because of so many other dynamics around it. And what's interesting is children do not want more attention from parents. Parents do not want more attention from children. But both parents and children report wanting more shared attention. They want to be able to have more time together in a shared attention setting. They don't necessarily want more attention. And that, I think, comes back to some of the family dynamics I'll lay out. So the traditional approaches typically, often, if you see even recommendations even 5-6 years ago, most of these organizations would be a restrictive strategy. Look at screen time, think about how much screen time they're having, and cut down on the screen time. And the reality is that doesn't necessarily work that well in the present state, because there are too many dimensions to it. And if we just clump everything into one dimension, one measure that says screen time, and that's the only category we're dealing with, then we're not really engaging, or it's harder to engage with children in a way that they feel they're being heard. And so the screen time capture gives a good sort of rough guide, but it doesn't tell you the details that might be effective in sort of really coming up with a meaningful plan. So these are studies based on children reports of what they think they do online. So they see sort of 4 primary categories of what they do. One is the aspect of I'm online to feel socially connected to my circle, to a broader circle, to my peers, to like-minded people. And they see gaming and entertainment as a huge source of outlet for their online use, online and device use, not just online. Information, learning. Again, when we say learning, structured school, online school is of course the new thing that they have to grapple with. But self-directed learning, just going to Red TED Art or looking up some DIY crafts or looking up how to build a computer together, put a computer together. Self-directed learning is something they do naturally because they just are craving for as much information as they can get. And the final part is, again, goes back to this idea of the Generation Z, the new generation, or what we would think as the children of today, think of themselves as creators, content creators. They're not just the consumers. So there is an outlet for creativity there as well. So now the question is, how can we leverage these 4 different sort of broad categories or ideas and put them together in a way that might excite them, but yet sort of protect them in some ways against some of the harms and risks we've talked about. I want to sort of say there are 2 tenets. If you forget everything else or if you don't care about anything else, this really goes back to the grandma insight. But really, this is what all of the studies are really telling you overarchingly. Modeling, modeling, modeling. We model moderation, we model accountability, we model safe practices, we model ethical practices. And the other aspect to it is what I think of as 3 C's. Again, this is not just me. This is based on research findings. Connection, conversation, and consistency. So what do I mean by that? And I want to sort of separate connection and conversation. One of the children's reports on digital and device use, the parent-children tension that I talked about, talks about how parents believe they're communicating with children, and children believe that they are given a prescriptive set of rules that everybody should follow or they're supposed to follow. So parents think, well, we talked about this. And of course, the child is thinking, well, no, we didn't talk about it. You said, and I didn't have a chance to actually tell you whether I want this or I don't want this. Now, this is not always true. Of course, we live in a wildly different time than what we were, and of course the same can be said of our parents and their parents and so on. But the reality is connection is about just listening, just thinking about their perspective, regardless of giving your judgment or giving our input. Conversation, I see it as a two-way street, something that we can engage and negotiate. But the connection sort of comes before the conversation. Consistency is again the other element that, as I said, the grandma insight. No matter what we do, the smallest of steps, consistent practice goes a long way than a big step that we do for one day and then we're not able to revisit. So having a sustainable practice is really important, sustainable to your family, to your personality, to your child's personality, to your needs. And so what I do want to emphasize is this is not how do we parent our children, but really in some ways, how do we parent ourselves? How do we create a family digital plan that works for us and our children? And so in some ways, the first step is learning together. That is, we don't have the luxury or the option to not know about these apps because the apps are there. We do not have the option to tell our kids, don't use it, because they will use it, because they do need to use it in some contexts. And so we don't have an option but to learn together, plan together. Again, it has to come from giving them a power of agency. That doesn't permissive. It doesn't mean allowing them to do whatever they want to do. But if we don't engage with them, if the plan doesn't come from them, there is no way we can hold them accountable to it. And practice together. And now putting a little bit more sort of concrete, but still generic and abstract concepts. First, we have to know what is available today. This can be a joint sort of social activity you do together as a family, and it doesn't, I'll talk about some sort of challenges that we have today later when it comes up in the discussion. Understand the benefits and risks that are app specific and just more generally being online, being on social media and so on. What are children and our interests, needs and desires? What is our lifestyle like? How will our plan fit with the current lifestyle, with our current needs, with our current interests and with our desires? And what are some ethical practices we can think about? How do we not give ourselves the license to be unkind because we don't have to reveal who we are? We might not model that in intentional ways, but it might be useful to have conversations about bringing empathy in anonymous contexts with our children. So ethical sort of practice comes there. Create the plan based on needs, interests, lifestyle, schedule, and some rules. What you do matters, not just the amount of time. What you do online is, the devil is in the details, and the devil is very specific to each one of the family setting. There is no overarching recommendation that somebody could give that would ever be meaningful for any one of our family settings. But time limits are good rubric. How much does matter? Doing 4 hours versus half an hour versus 10 minutes, all of these do matter. So time limits do matter. And this is key. Accountability, meaning say if I have some monitoring apps, tracking apps for tracking use and so on and so forth. Now, we don't want to really position this as something that children are we are monitoring to see what they're doing online, because the reality is they know how to fight the system before we will ever know how they got there. So if it's about, I'm going to come up with the best scheme that my child will not be able to crack, doesn't matter if you're the best engineer in town, if you're the best hacker in town, your kids will outsmart you. It's just a matter of time. And so the point is, therefore, that accountability and control, it might be useful to talk about it as paths to trust. Meaning, if I know that you're consistently keeping up with the usage, with the tracking, with the rules we have in place, then it gives, as a parent, more confidence to trust them. And again, the accountability measures are not just for the children. We can put the same apps that our children are held to as standards. There is no reason we cannot track our own usage, just as how we ask our kids to be able to track their own usage. Again, I would say be creative. They have some really interesting ideas of how to make this a fun thing. How do you gamify? Who was online more? I saw you were there half an hour. I mean, of course, you don't want to become crazy, but some of these things actually are interesting for them. Crucial part, sticking to the plan, allowing kids to make informed decisions. They are agents. They can make really strong decisions, and we have to give them the power to make those decisions at small levels at different ages, and bigger as they get older. So it's not so much that suddenly you turn a switch on. I always joke about it in the US and Canada. Say, okay, 12 years you can babysit. Until 12, you cannot stay home by yourself. It's not that suddenly you turn 12 and then magically your responsibilities just appear. So really that agency can be provided from very little to when they are older. Modeling as a family, practicing the 3 C's. Most importantly, this is a moving goalpost. There is no plan that you or I can ever come up with that will be meaningful next year, 6 months, or even 3 months. Kids change, technology changes, our needs change, and so this has to be a plan that will adapt. With every new thing that comes in, there has to be a new conversation, a new plan, new going back to the board that might have to happen. Now, one of the questions that often get asked is, okay, this is all great. We can reason with teenagers, preteens. First of all, that's not so easy. If you have, I don't have a teenager yet, so I'm sure there are, parents that are like, yeah, you think you can reason with your teenagers? Let's see how it gets you. But the reality is we can have conversations, whether they agree or not. With younger kids, it's different. You will still have conversations. You will still have connection. You will still have consistency. You will still model with moderation. You will still model with accountability. You will still model with safe practice. But I see it as often with kids, with little kids, it helps to provide a way to couple physical movement with watching. We live in a pandemic. We have work from home challenges. So it's not that kids can't be on, they have to be on TV sometimes. They have to be the babysitter. We don't want that, but there is a reason or situation where that might happen. So provide opportunities for physical movement. Kids love physical movement. It can be yoga, it can be music, it can be dance, it can be doing splits when you're watching a show. Whatever it is, provide some physicality to it when they're engaging in the digital space. Apps with tactile, that works too, but that has its own sort of issue, so we can come back to that later. But physical movement within a physical space while engaging in the digital world can help little kids at least disengage from it more easily. Session length. See if you can limit, not always possible, but if you can limit session length to short stretches. So 3 hours split into 20 minutes is a very different ball game than 3 hours being glued with absolutely sort of no way to disengage. So engaging and disengaging is a really useful skill for little kids to do when they're working and learning how to navigate the digital world. Together time. Joint device use. So you're not co-viewing time. Often we'd say, okay, watch a show so that I can get my shower in. I have done this. I wish I can tell you I didn't or I don't. But the thing is, you do want to model some sort of together viewing time. You look at videos together. You watch shows together. So that there is some sort of, it's not just an isolation. I do this thing on my own when parents aren't around, or at least not always, so that it models what safe practice is. Model short, with younger kids, model short me time, device-free time, where there is very little attention. The parent is around for general supervision, for physical safety, but they are playing alone. Now, again, our grandmas, our families, our bigger families naturally provided for this when we were younger. With our kids, we have to sort of almost schedule it in, practice it more consciously, that having that me sort of what is good old-fashioned small amount of neglect, where you're saying, not neglect, I don't want to use that word, but really that you're playing by yourself without engaging. Having clear rules and sticking to them about device-free zones, sleeping and meal times, and really there is sort of no negotiation around that as much as possible if that situation allows it. Finally, using storytelling as a means to educate or build awareness on online safety. How do you be safe online? How do you be safe when you're working with the device? Using storytelling for really young kids can be a very powerful mechanism to sort of make it interesting, but also to bring home the point of how to sort of effectively implement it. And taking a step back, one of the things, again, I'm not going to get into the details now, just I will sort of give you that brief overview, and then if Sujatha has questions, I can take those. How do we support child's sort of well-being and potential in the digital age, in the pandemic, and beyond? So it's not specific to either the digital age or even the pandemic. And studies sort of point to a huge role for agency, providing them the skills, but also the ability to make small decisions, age-appropriate decisions as they go along. encouraging a growth mindset, focusing on learning and mastery rather than focusing on performance outcome. Did you get 100? Did you get first? Or what is your rank? Or how many more people are more than you or less than you? Again, these are all very easy to say, much harder to practice, but encouraging a growth mindset will really help them in some concrete ways. Most importantly, encouraging them to embrace failures. Almost not wanting failures for your kids, but being okay and almost seeing the value for kids failing. We don't have the perfect template for creating failure-free children. We weren't those kids because we made mistakes. Our parents warned us, we still made the mistakes. And so in some ways, encouraging failure as a mechanism to learning really can help in their well-being. It really helps not just for maximizing potential, but also for protecting against sort of stress, anxiety, depression. Engaging parent involvement. This involvement doesn't have to be a lot of hours. Quality, meaning really, really does matter. Connection and communication and consistency. Finally, as I said, the grandma insight, model, model, model. Model the goals you desire in your children, model the mindset you desire in our children, and model the behavior we really desire in our children. And so, you do want to think about stress, anxiety, and depression. Again, these are mental well-being. It's not so much this causes, digital device use causes this or effect. It's really a chicken and egg. And so just consider that. As a parent, how can you do? What can you do? Okay, I'm really busy. I don't have time to come up with a family digital plan. I don't have time to sit and think about how to do this. And, this is so overwhelming. How do we go about this? The small things matter. Again, these are not findings that I have come up with. These are some of the practitioner recommendations for COVID coping, but I think it really translates beautifully for parenting as well outside. Small things matter. Everything interacts. A small gear change can have a big effect. So sometimes just something like moderating sleep time or practicing good sleep time or sleep schedule ourselves can suddenly have huge effects that are much bigger than what we think we are going to get in terms of its effect. So everything interacts, so small changes can go a long way. Patterns really matter. Consistent patterns matter. Meaning smallest of changes you do, but consistently you do it, so it makes a big effect on children. They will notice it, they will tell you so. They are willing to forget all of the less conducive patterns we've had if we show them one day where they are willing to sort of engage in a different perspective. Meaning matters. Again, it's not the amount of time, what that meaning tells you. That 5 minutes of playing with a child on a game that they are interested in can go a long way, much longer than 20 minutes of telling them why they should succeed in school, which we still want. I'm not saying we don't want that, but again, the meaning really does matter. Compassion for self and others. Again, as a parent, I often feel like self-compassion just doesn't feel like it sits, or even if I think it seems like a good idea, is not something that I'm able to practice. It's like the dentist. The first thing that you stop doing when you get stressed is not visit your dentist, because like, oh, I don't need to go until there's a problem. Self-care, I don't need to do until there's really a problem. But modeling that really does help. Most importantly, reaching out, whether it's family support, extended support, or professional help. As parents, we all know we don't have answers. And we don't want to give them a feeling that we have the answers, because we don't. In reality, we don't. And being able to reach out and seek support is something we should, or we can actively model for our children, so that they know this is something that can be done, there is utility in doing that. This is something I feel children are experts. Present moment awareness. COVID is really stress-inducing. You think of the number of deaths, you think of the graphs, you look at the graphs, that's enough to get anybody, psyched out. But this moment, how you're feeling, what you're feeling, health, love, care, concern, just that small connections. Present moment awareness sounds so much of some ways jargon, but really so many studies show that mindfulness really has a huge impact. Children practice this. Sometimes we just need to see it to know, okay, today is a good day, so they're going to be happy. Tomorrow is a bad day, they're going to believe that that is the end of the world. And that's okay, because that sort of present moment awareness sometimes is really, really useful. And really, I want to sort of think about the food for thought of the duality of sort of parent and modeling this for our children. We are capable of amazing things. We are resilient. We will bounce back. And yet, the reality is we are all vulnerable. We are all imperfect. Modeling vulnerability, modeling imperfection as a parent is probably the biggest gift we can give our children in the digital age, where there is this happiness bias. Everybody needs to be happy. Everybody needs to be perfect. It's okay as parents to not have answers. It's okay as parents to be imperfect and vulnerable. That doesn't necessarily mean we don't have a growth mindset. So I think that's kind of where I will leave, and I'm sure, Sujatha, if you have questions, I'm certainly happy to go into the findings or studies or thoughts, anything that you might have.
It's wonderful. I think that was a fabulous end-to-end journey of the digital and the social and the connectedness and all of that you spoke about. There are a whole lot of tips and techniques that you've also shared, so we won't have to go into those specifically. I'm just going to call out a couple of questions that came to my mind.
Sujatha, sorry to interrupt. But Priya, can we stop the share screen so that we can see? Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Megu.
Sorry,
Okay. So Priya, that question was about, connected with the digital tension that you spoke about, right? And you also mentioned something, and you said you'd revisit that, and I want to pick that up. This is about, you mentioned that there's a dominant increase in social media, but as and when parents call it out, it increases and the anxiety increases. You mentioned something along those lines, and connecting that to the piece around digital tension, as well as a question around, despite all of this, how can we continue to maximize happiness? Because if you're looking at cognitive, positive parenting that, all of us need to embrace, how can we go about doing that?
That's really some beautiful points that you've laid out. So maybe I'll try to unpack each of those. So going back to this idea of, parents underestimating, children's digital use, but also our own digital use, sort of almost looking back at the lens. And it's interesting, I'm sure in many families, or there are family members that are active tech users, and there are those that are like, okay, I have to use tech. It's like driving. I have to do it, but I don't like it. And I'm certainly what I would say is the active tech user that embraces, like, any new thing, I'll try it. I'm not good at games, but I still try to sort of, I'm interested in things. And my partner isn't. He feels like, well, it's just there to be a utility, but not necessarily all of these other aspects. And so I was really curious, just almost started out of, let me just see how long I spend online. I mean, not online, just on my phone. So I added a tracking app just for my own self. And literally, I kid you not, Sujatha, I was doing 3 jobs during the pandemic. One was my actual work where I'm teaching online. And the other is, of course, the home duties that we all struggle with and cope. And the third is being online. And I do not joke about it when I said there can be on an average of 5 to 6 hours that I'm online. Now, I'm sort of admitting sort of out of, openly here, not so much to say, yes, this is where I am, so I'm sort of owning it. But really, it's remarkable how much time we can be online and be completely unaware of it. I'm in the tech field. I do this for a living, and yet I would not have estimated that I spend 6 hours on a day being on my phone. I can come up with a million excuses why I was online. I was coordinating this, I was coordinating that, I was doing this, I was doing that. That doesn't explain a part-time or almost a full-time job that I'm doing with my device. And so using our own sort of insight can really help make a compelling case for kids, but mostly just for our own self, saying, well, then I can't really talk about not that we can't. It's not that we have to be perfect in order for us to tell kids that this is something that is what to watch for. But recognizing that we are struggling with those same struggles can be really useful. Then the other thing is the source of tension with social media. The thing is, there are 2 things I feel are really useful. One is kids come in with any conversation with a lot of emotion and a lot of curiosity. And you can't fault them for that, because those are the 2 things that really serves them well no matter what. They can learn a lot really quickly, and they get really opinionated about a lot of things really quickly. Now, I wish we can say, now, as adults, at least as a parent, I have the emotion part down to the wire. I can just as quickly become emotional, just as quickly become opinionated. I don't necessarily have the same curiosity that my kids have. Or at least when I'm stressed, it's much easier to forget the curiosity part. And so what you have is parents who feel like, okay, social media is bad. And I'm coming at it with, okay, let me start a communication channel. But it's actually a one-way street. The parent is telling, or I as a parent feel like I have to tell, these are all the dangers you would know if you had my experience, if you had my knowledge. And kids are coming at it with, you don't have my curiosity. They don't know to tell this, but the reality is they are utterly curious. They are utterly knowledgeable. They are utterly in the moment. They are willing to engage if we can connect. So the connect part is where you don't judge. Just that 5 minutes doesn't mean you don't have an opinion. It doesn't mean you're not going to parent. But that first part is, what is it that you really want? Why is it that you want? And just listening goes a long way in sort of diffusing that emotion. And then that curiosity allows them to know what we have to say, but also to teach us, hey, but have you thought about this other part? Older kids do this more, younger kids do this less, but in a different way they do that too. They communicate just as effectively.
And I really love the way in which you brought the piece around cognitive dissonance, right? So we're talking about something, but we are probably not modeling it. And like you mentioned, kids tend to pick up these cues really fast. And we also have the activist role that they play, not just in the, the political discussions, but it's also about what kind of parenting we are demonstrating to them. So the modeling part of it becomes really important. And I think I'm really, I have a question connected to that, which is how then can parents, or based on your experience or the research that you've gone through, we've been speaking about embracing failures for children, but what about embracing failure for parents? Because sometimes it could be difficult not to sit on the high horses and, suspend judgment, because you are in the judgment seat at times and you're trying to shake it off. But coming to terms with that, coming to terms with self-care and all of it, right? How is it possible, or what kind of thoughts do you have around embracing failures for parents?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. If somebody had asked me to put a mirror on myself of how I thought about myself, one of my identity at some point, it's transferred over time, is I was this, okay, I will do everything well, or I'll try to do everything well, and if it doesn't, then I will figure out how or why it doesn't happen. Sometimes I just took a laid back attitude of I didn't care, but when I cared, I really was one of those people that felt like I couldn't deal with failures. And this is true. I mean, this is how I always felt. And, there was a stress associated with actually sort of feeling like, okay, what if this fails? And it's almost sort of prophetically sort of saying, okay, that's never going to work. And then it's like, your head saying, okay, see, I told you it's not going to work. And it surely doesn't work. But I think one of the things is, this is where I think, sometimes our children can really, really guide us. And I can say this from my own self-experience. My son is definitely much more relaxed, and I wish I could be like him, but I am not, so I can't pretend that I'm Zen. Because he's just like, it doesn't matter, you want me to do this here, but he does exactly what he wants to, even at 6 years old. But he doesn't necessarily feel like he has to fight. My daughter is the activist all the way. She is about fairness. Just because you're the parent, how is it? And she will show it with her eyes, right? And then I always have this moment of, because I said so, because I'm the parent, because I'm older, because I have the power. And yet that doesn't necessarily work. But the one thing that she models for me is really two things. One is being incurably optimistic, which I wish I can, but that's not easy for me. But kids are always much more hopeful about things working out than adults are. Now, that doesn't mean they don't struggle with mental well-being. That doesn't mean they don't struggle with stress and anxiety. But they have the ability to sort of say, okay, think that it's okay. But the failure really for them, because they're learning so much and failing so much in sort of everyday things, they embrace it like nobody's business, because it's like, well, what do I do? If I don't embrace failure, how am I going to learn how to skateboard? How am I going to learn how to play carom board, how to play chess? So they really model, I feel, failure at a small level, but the small level really translates. And for me, my biggest epiphany, I would say, is Realizing failing as a parent is just as much a failure that I should be okay with embracing and admitting to my children. That is not inconsistency. Admitting our failures or struggles as a parent is not being a weak parent, is not being an inconsistent parent. It means it's a parent that's acknowledging that you need work just as how we are encouraging them to look into themselves.
I think that's actually about authentic parenting, because if we are able to showcase it and demonstrate it and feel comfortable about it, right? You mentioned this piece about we are incurably optimistic, and it's so true about it. Is there something that we can pick up from there? And I was thinking of, are there opportunities for reverse mentoring with children? Because, there are so many things they're good at. It could be from the way in which they're using the digital space, and we can moderate it. We can, come to terms with it and have conversations about that, like you said, and bring in some consistency. But is there something else that we can pick up from them, from their enthusiasm, from the, we spoke about it and you mentioned that also. Do they come into a conversation with so much of emotions? Are we able to pick up the emotions? Are we able to pick up the empathy that they look at things with, and then take it forward? Because I think this is a beautiful way in which we can learn from children, because they have so much out there. This is something that I've always been intrigued with. And it was wonderful to hear you, Priya, and the way in which you took us through this entire journey, and a whole lot of tips and tricks about dealing with children and enjoying the parenting part of it. I love the way you brought in the gamification and the screen share and the games that we can have in the me time and all of it. So it's been a beautiful conversation, and I can also see it in a couple of the chat questions. What is the role that fathers can play in this journey? And I'm thinking that when we say mothers out here, it's not just the moms. We're talking about fathers as well, because they play an important role and an integral role in the entire journey. But let you take that question.
Okay, that's an excellent question, and something that sort of goes back to the work that I've done with the Kid Care or Canada organization that I was talking about. The thing is, some of the most now there are one ways to think about it. There are some specific gender roles that work in some families and some doesn't, but the reality is the two parents that come, or parent and a grandparent or caregiver, whoever it is that comes, they all come with different perspectives. There's always the time where there is something that we are negotiating or probably fighting with our kids, and then this other parent is looking at us like, well, I have a different view to this, and is there a way I can sort of salvage? Or there's this there is this intricate sort of play that happens between two caregivers while they are sort of arguing with the child, and the child picks up on it. It's like, oh, somewhere there looks like a gap here. Let me see if there is a way to segue, to know. But the reality is, that's just there is beauty in that. There is protection in that. Meaning, if both parents did exactly the same role, or both caregivers did exactly the same thing, it probably would not be a very conducive relationship. It probably would not work for parenting in any case. And so really that complementary role is very, very important. And I always say this, like, I'm certainly the disciplinarian in the house, but I'm also the more impulsive person. I'm also the one that is quick to make mistakes, but also recognize that I've made a mistake. My partner is much more laid back, but he also feels like, well, I don't have to apologize because I didn't do anything wrong to the child. And it's true. He's much more sort of reserved, considerate. But I also say that part of what allows me to be the disciplinarian is there is a soft spot that they can fall. When I am in that moment where I'm not good, I'm not conducive for engaging in a good conversation. When I'm in my elements where I'm like, I don't want to engage, this is my story and I'm sticking to it, I'm getting upset, having that sweet spot, whether it is the dad, whether it's a caregiver, but fathers especially, each changing dynamic, each family dynamic is different, but the complementary roles are key, not for children to sort of find the gap and play with it. Of course they do that, that's their job. But that is a very protective mechanism for their well-being, but also just long-term outcomes themselves, just in terms of parenting styles.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I think that takes us through the entire trajectory of parenting and the pitfalls and coming out of it and all of it. So a wonderful conversation with you on cognitive behavior of children and how to deal with it. I
So,
know that we are
sorry,
at the end
Sujatha,
of
one
time.
thing, yeah.
Yeah,
So I guess the
yeah,
only thing I would say is yes, lots and lots of studies have shown very, very sort of tangible benefits for a role of fathers that is different
yeah.
from primary caregivers, like other caregivers, different from primary caregivers, mostly in the context of fathers. That's sort of unique. Yeah.
Thanks for reiterating that. With that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Meghu, in case
Yeah,
there
sure.
are any other questions that you want to pick up from the chat.
Yeah, there is one more question here. Mr. JS has asked, child is the father of man always fascinated me. Adult learning disability seems to make them rigid and non-creative. Will humility help parents? That's the question he has. The rest of you, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box and Priya can answer them one by one. Thank you.
This is great. That's a beautiful question, Jace, because yes, and I think humility, compassion, and openness. Again, these are very, very easy to say, but very hard to practice. And as I said, I wish I can tell you I practice this every moment. One of my biggest learning I feel in sort of this pandemic, especially, is to say every small moment. Okay, today I did good on this episode where I didn't blow up and be unreasonable. That's great. So the humility really does help, meaning we don't have all answers. We will be the first to admit that to ourselves, to our partners, and to even our kids after they grow up. But somewhere when we are parenting them, it's very hard to admit that we don't know the answers, or we are far from the experts in any of this. Even, it doesn't matter how much research I know. And so the humility really will help, and if it comes in an authentic space. Sometimes I have a way of saying, oh, I must be wrong, but in a passive aggressive way where I'm guilting the child into doing it. That doesn't necessarily work. They pick up on what is authentic. Authentic humility, authentic compassion, authentic openness. Really, kids pick up on it and really, really help us navigate this sort of space.
And there's one question here. My 9-year-old worries all the time. He worries about asteroids hitting Earth, what happens as he ages, etc. So you can imagine the pandemic has put him in such a tough spot. How can I help him?
That's such a beautiful question. I mean, this is where every sort of recommendation strategy, I kept thinking, oh, but this is too specific. This may not work. This may not work for some families. Same thing for, it's the dyad. What works for one parent-child combination family setting will not work for another, right? And when you think of a warrior child, what are the protective strategies? What are the protective things for worrying kids? They are naturally less impulsive. That's the reality, is that they think about a million things, sometimes a little too many things before they act. But that protects them in the digital world they live in. So sometimes acknowledging why some of that can be useful in a moderated way can be a starting point. I feel it helps them recognize there is value in this worrying. That doesn't mean extreme worrying is desirable behavior and therefore I should engage in it. But recognizing that that is a protective strategy that can help them in some situation is a good starting point. Then to sieve out, sometimes having specific strategies depending on the age, listing out specific fears and building awareness based on those specific fears. What is the likelihood? When is the last time this happened? That doesn't mean it's not going to happen tomorrow. That's a fair point, and we have to take that as a fair point. But building awareness specific, sometimes it's a more generic worry. Then again, conversations, connection and conversations can go a long way. But then knowing that the child can seek your help as a first sort of pass. But if needed, that professional help is not a sign of weakness, and modeling that for the child and showing the child that that is a possibility. So depending on the specificity of the worrying and the extent of worrying, the strategy and approach might be slightly different.
Okay. Thank you. So then there's one question here. It appears that the multi-sensory experience of entertainment on TV or on the internet can make the physical world less exciting or even boring. So how do we protect against this? Valid question when I have that in mind.
That's a beautiful question and really relevant question. I do want to sort of point out that most of the research, but more so with younger kids, but also true for older kids, adults, like, we process language better when we can see the faces And when we can feel the mouth, and so even for people who are, they can see well, just having tactile information. So the multisensory processing is not something that we learn over time, but there is a lot of that. Even infants as young as 6 months detect inconsistency in sort of auditory information and visual information, what comes through the ear, what comes through the eyes. Putting them together is a really, really vital skill, particularly in a social context, that really young infants do it. And almost newborns, again, match patterns of audio and visual and all of that. So what it means is, one, we do this all the time. The multisensory perception is there are lots of arguments to make that this might be wired in. There are sensory regions, there are brain regions that are multimodal, multisensory, that's built in from the get-go. So now having it in the digital space will not necessarily make the physical space less boring. It'll be an added kind of dimension that you add on to it, and kids will then find a new way to put them together. That is, the sum of parts, the whole is greater than sum of parts, meaning putting them together is much more enriching than having just two things, one after the other. And so I don't necessarily think it's going to make it boring. But here is another way to tie it. So there is dancing and yoga in the presence of, say, a device, and then doing dancing and yoga without the device. So there is a connecting thread of how to build connection that is rooted in the digital space, but then taken away from the digital space, so that there is some sort of variety that you build in. You do the same action, but in two different contexts that can really help young children reinforce the idea that this is not the only context in which I do this.
I love that answer, because my grandson, who is like going to be 7, he is going to a summer camp. Of course, everything is online now, and they do it so well that the child is not sitting in front of the computer at all. He's in fact running about the house, and the activities are in such a way that he goes from room to room, just like how play should be for a child as young as him. So we have to get creative, I think, and try to wean them away from the internet and the colorful things it offers. We have a couple of questions here. Let me go back.
Also, given the kind of pandemic and closed setups that we might have to stay in for a while.
Yes. How to keep the child's curiosity alive in spite of the parents' indifference? Ms. Raja has asked that.
And that's a beaut. Again, I just wish, sometimes these things, there is so many things you can discuss. One of the things is what I think of as these time intervals, meaning we all cannot be distracted all the time. Of course, sometimes it is just because we've been so busy in meetings and cooking and cleaning, and it's incredibly difficult to find that 5 minutes. But that's why that small snippet of time, 5 minutes of engaging in their curiosity, can go a long way, because for them, they have a different conception of time. It's bound with quality. So it doesn't matter that there is 4 hours, or it doesn't matter that mom, or dad worked 5 hours to work on this project for me. For them, that 5 minutes where we gave them undivided attention, and not what we think is good for them, but in what they want to do at this moment in time. And it's very difficult to do that, but somewhere the pandemic, with not driving, with not going out, with not attending, festivals, functions, sometimes that 5 minutes, you can find it between meetings. Okay, what are you doing? Oh, what is that? That's really interesting. And it's not, somewhere there is a fake it till you make it kind of a thing, where you kind of have to feel interested before that interest can actually kick in. But the reality is, they will see immediately that you're engaged. They will play that dance with you even before you actually truly start believing that I really care about Minecraft. I really care about somebody that's playing Minecraft that you want to talk about for the next 2 hours or 5 minutes.
Thank you. Maithili's question: if your child does not wish to openly express his or her difficulty in learning methodology, yet he or she feels the pressure not performing well, how do you discover and help?
Okay, that's a really good question. And if you don't mind, is it possible for me to just quickly, just share one slide?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. It'll really make a point that I think is almost just fascinating. And I wish I can tell, I just saw it while I was doing research for this, and it was just really, so let me just. Okay, so what I'm showing you here, I'm just going to walk you through the main insight here. But this is performance that children have had on a science test. Middle schoolers have had on a science test performance. And the conditions are, now these are natural conditions that just worked out in the family. So it's not that they're put into these conditions. One is the parent is helping the child with his or her science homework. And the other is parent is obtaining science related software and materials for the child to make sure that science knowledge and learning is enriched. Discussing with my child how science is used in everyday life. Discussing science related career options in my child. Ask my child how they are performing in the science class. Discuss how my child is doing at school, generally, not specific to science. Spend time just talking to my child. And the final condition is eating a meal together as a family at the table. Okay? What I want you to see is just two things that are worth pointing out. Having a meal together at the table predicts the largest performance in science. This is across countries over a range of different settings. And directly helping with science homework has a negative effect on the performance. Now, doesn't mean, oh, therefore don't teach your kids anything, let them be on their own device. But you have to take each study with a grain of salt. But it's a beautiful pattern, I think, that's worth sort of paying attention to. Now, what you see is spending time talking to the child is also beneficial, but not as beneficial in some ways as eating a meal together. Now, what is going on there? One possible idea could be eating a meal together can be a more structured environment, more naturally structured environment, where the child knows certain predicted schedule slots that happen. Like when I was a kid, I knew at 8 p.m. I would get my dinner right around the time there was news going on, because that's when my granddad would eat. When my granddad would eat, everybody else in the family would eat. And that predictability goes a long way in performance, well-being, you name it, and social conversations. So coming back to the point that was brought up, how do you approach when they are worried about their performance? Yes, you cannot address the elephant in the room by talking to the elephant. That's the reality of the world we live in. So talking about their performance and how they can do better is problem solving. That doesn't build a connection. Building a connection starts from the small things, irrelevant things, small things that matter in the end, not so much in that moment. So, not all of us have the luxury of having a mealtime together, but if you can, that's great. But if you have grandparents, if there is something that you can arrange every 2 days, some days this is connection time. And it doesn't have to be formal, but it has to be consistent so that the child knows there are opportunities for conversations that are not centered around, okay, show me your report card, now let's talk about your science performance. Because that is a sure shot recipe for the child feeling the pressure and completely closing down and just say, let me just keep quiet, let them yell, and it'll be done.
That's valuable insight.
Great.
It's a very valuable insight. When we talk about don't talk shop, this is what it is. And I think this is a brilliant depiction of have the meal together. The family structures are important. The social connectedness is more important than actually talking about, things that don't matter to the child. Beautiful.
Yeah, true. Priya, can you stop the share screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a question from an adolescent parent. My 15-year-old kid is always on screen, not comes out to the screen, keeps browsing and taking inputs on different subjects, feels study is not important. Suddenly, study has come down very drastically. How to convince him and solve this issue?
That's a really... Lalita, I do want to say that there are lots of studies that show that children report spending less hours on school related matters during online school, during COVID period. Studies that have been done, say, 2020, and a few released this year as well. So it's not so much that parents feel like there's no learning happening or there's no studying happening. Children actually report they are working, or they feel like they're working less. Now, two things I do want to say is, just because children report they're studying less doesn't necessarily, it's a different challenge. As somebody that teaches online, I can tell that I'm able to cover 40% of what I normally do in a physical space. And it is, it's almost like really there's guilt of like, how am I going to cover everything I'm going to do? But I almost have to say, you know what, I'm going to cover as much. Now, school teachers don't have that luxury. They have to cover everything because their child has to be prepared for the exams, for the next standard, whatever it is. So they don't have that as a college professor, because I write my own exams. I can say, you know what, I'm not going to test them on this, or I'll tell them this is important, but I'm not going to cover that. I don't want to do. But so online school is a different challenge, not just for the teachers, but also for the children. It's much harder to be engaged. 1 hour of being engaged is hard for us as adults. And imagine 3 hours, 4 hours, or even 2 hours, or even half an hour to be engaged for kids when they don't have to turn on video. But also, it's not even about turning on video, right? Just being engaged in the online space is a challenge. So recognizing that it's a different learning, we are in the pandemic where it will be a different space, is useful, at least as a parent, for a coping mechanism more than anything else, number one. Number two, I think having some rules and guidelines about device use, social media use, or other sort of aspects of app use during school is a conversation that's worth having. Now, if we say don't do this during school, it comes back to this idea of parents always tell us what not to do. They don't tell us when else can we do this. So having sort of specific times where you say, you know what, after you're done this, and this is not a sort of, okay, trade. It's a negotiation. There is a difference between a trade and a negotiation. Trade is saying, I'm giving you this, you give me this. Barter doesn't work with kids because they don't see the value in it. Because you're bartering for you what you think is good, and they don't think it's for their good in any case. So how do we then barter? But negotiating, I think having a conversation might help. Having some rules, expectations. So for example, you can say, when somebody is having a one-on-one conversation, you cannot engage in the phone. Now, if you say that, myself included, I have to be that parent that owns up to the mistake of saying, you know what, I'm distracted when you talk to me. So that's just not as fair. So one option is to sort of think about some ground rules for during school, but providing clear, asking for solutions for how they can do those things outside of school, and really sort of scheduling that in, giving them the power, the agency to feel that they're choosing to do this now versus now versus then, as opposed to now or never.
Thank you. We have I think Mr. Ranganathan has raised his hand. You can unmute yourself, sir, and ask any question. I think I've given you the permission. If you have a question that is, your hand is raised, that's why. Yeah, you can ask.
A friend, Megalai. She is only hosting.
Okay.
Hand sorry.
Okay, no problem. Any other questions? You can unmute, and you can also talk to Priya. We just have a few more minutes left.
I think there's one question is, how do you say no to a child?
Yes, Mr. Venkatapati, regular. How do you say no to a child?
Yeah, and again, this really comes back to, in some ways, parent age, child's age, what is the no for, and really family dynamics. Some families don't believe in wanting to say a no until they're old enough to be able to know yes from no, and knowing the difference and learning it. And that's fine too. You can't really say, oh, that's wrong, or this is right. What works? But child's age really matters, and what is the no for? No for picking a t-shirt color, or even whether they should wear one shoe versus the other, or should wear a shoe or not wear a shoe, versus, touching the flame, which we know. We will not allow a child near the stove. But somewhere that saying no for what we say no really does matter from the youngest of ages. Again, as I said, I wish I can say I practice all of this, but it's useful to sort of keep those in mind. What do we say no for? But consistently say no for those things with reasons, age-appropriate reasons will sort of, the pattern will help.
Okay. I think with this we come to the end of the session. I'm just one call for just one quick question if you have, because I don't want to keep Priya waiting, and she has 2 kids also at home.
So how to regulate a child for proper eating habit? That's a great question. And really, sleep and eating, sleep and meals are one of the sort of major predictors for not just outcomes, performance outcomes, success, all of that is definitely there, but also for well-being, mental well-being, stress, anxiety, and depression protection. And so the again, one of the, how do you, for proper eating habits, say not in front of device or eating at a set time. Again, that depends on each family schedule, but I would prioritize structured meal times, structured sleep times over everything else if there is a possibility to do that. Again, consistency and modeling. These are the two things that eventually they will turn around. They cannot be playing by themselves for 3 hours for 3 years. They can do that for 2 days, they can do that for 3 days, they can do that for 4 days, 5 days. Eventually they'll realize, okay, everybody is eating at this time. Probably this is probably more fun to do than to be by myself.
Yeah, Mr. JS has something to say. Mr. JS is a world-class trainer and a coach with several years of experience from Indian Oil Corporation. Welcome, sir. So happy to see you here. I think you want to say something, so please go ahead.
Yeah. It's not a question, just to appreciate Dr. Priya, excellent opening up of the minds for parents. It has been a very interesting and learning time for us. A few things occurred to me that monkey see, monkey do. Like if we parent monkeys demonstrate, I have seen from my experience of raising 2 kids and learning from my parents the way they treated me, that role modeling and connecting. I think connecting, Priya underlined it, bold, italic, underline. Connecting gives all the solutions. Unless we are willing to listen, children immediately find out whether you are in advisory mode or in a power mode. So I think it's a very, very great learning today. Thanks, Priya. Thanks, Magalai. And of course, moderator also brought in excellent questions. Thank you so much for the valuable time. That's it.
We have Dr. M.S. Ramachandran, a very senior doctor with us, and he has raised his hand. I think he wants to say something. Doctor, I have unmuted you. You can please go ahead. Hello, are you there? Any other questions? If somebody wants to say something, we'll quickly. Okay. I think it's time to end, Priya, and thanks, Priya, and thanks, Sujatha. It was a wonderful session, and I think we have to revisit. I have to revisit, so I'm waiting for the recording to go live so that I can go over point by point. So many valuable inputs were there, and it is so useful for the parents here as well as I can see a lot of heads of schools, teachers also here. And since it will be posted on YouTube, I think many people will also benefit from this. So thanks.
I do have to give a shout out. Sorry. I do have to give a shout out. I don't know, some of my teachers might be here. Every part of this role model comes from the parents and the teachers. And really, I feel a lot of that really comes back to the home setting, but as sort of interacting with the school setting as well.
Yeah.
And really, it's, the online school is very challenging for kids.
Yes.
But this will turn around, and that generation, the Generation Z, our kids will show us how to embrace the change and move on and learn and say, you know what, this is how you have to do it. We have to follow their sort of goalpost.
The parents as well as the teachers are doing a wonderful job, especially in these pandemic times. It's a big challenge for the teachers out there as well as the parents to keep them occupied all the time. So I'm sending healing energies and prayers to all those who are actually suffering, having people, recovering or going through COVID-19. We are sorry that I'm sure, let us just be positive. We will overcome. We will overcome as soon as possible. And let us take care of our children, their mental health and their physical health. And with that, I invite you to like the page LBN Tech Solutions for a future events, Ask the Expert. We have been having several topics. This is the 24th session actually on any topic under the sun. So please like the page and follow for future updates. And this session will be uploaded in LBN's People's Podium, which is our YouTube channel. And if you want to connect with Priya, you have some contact information which you can put in the chat box so that people can contact Priya directly for anything which they want to ask. So thanks for logging in from across the globe. We have people from the USA, from the West Coast, as Canada. Since people are unmuted, you can hear them. So thanks, Priya. You put the contact information here, so you can write to her and ask her all your queries which you may have. Good luck, Priya, and you did that was a wonderful, wonderful talk. And thanks, Sujatha. Thanks, Sujatha, for moderating the session so well. Thank you.
Thank you. It was my
Thank
pleasure.
Thank you. Thank
Lovely
you.
speaking.
Thank you, Sujatha.
Yeah, bye, bye, Priya. Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Good night, Priya. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a great day, the rest of you from India.